My name is Velsaroth of the 4th Sensor Array, junior ranked no longer after Lieutenant Os took a piece of shrapnel through the throat during the 2nd Keth barrage. I have been keeping this log because my superior ordered me to keep this log, and because I have run out of other things to do with my hands that do not involve counting the remaining ration packs or staring at the reactor readout and watching it decline like something that has already decided to die and is simply being polite about the timing. 43 survivors. The Sorrow of Veth lists 4 degrees to portside. The emergency lighting runs on a separate cell that will outlast everything else, which I find insulting, that we will sit in the dark with full visibility while the air recyclers fail. Whoever designed this ship had a very particular sense of irony. We have been in the Kessler debris field for 17 rotations. I am going to describe what the Kessler debris field is, not for any future reader of this log, there may not be one, but because I find that naming things precisely keeps my secondary nerve cluster from firing distress signals at random intervals into my spine. The Kessler field is a contested region, which is a collective military term meaning multiple parties want this space, none of them have won it yet, and anything that enters is considered a valid target by everyone simultaneously. It is approximately 40 light minutes across. It is full of the debris of previous battles, the Sorrow of Veth being the newest addition, and also full of Keth patrol drones that move in unpredictable arcs and fire on anything that registers as a power source. Our reactor registers as a power source. This is the fundamental problem. We cannot power down below 11% or the remaining life support collapses. We cannot power above 11% without triggering a full Keth targeting response. We sit at 11% and we wait, and every 6 rotations the patrol pattern brings 3 drones close enough that I can watch them on short-range sensors, their targeting arrays sweeping, and I hold my breath and they pass and I exhale and I know the next pass will be the same and the pass after that and eventually one of them will be slightly different and that will be the last thing I record. Lieutenant Os, before the shrapnel, had submitted a distress signal to Collective Command. Broadband, encrypted, the standard emergency packet with our coordinates and status and the casualty list that was smaller than. Collective Command received it. I know they received it because we got the automated acknowledgement. What we did not get was a response that contained the word rescue or fleet or incoming or anything except a reference number and a case classification of Tier 4 contested, which in collective doctrine means noted, filed, mathematically evaluated, determined to be non-viable for active extraction. Non-viable. I have been thinking about that word for 17 rotations. Non-viable. It is not wrong, exactly. The math is not wrong. Sending a rescue fleet into Keth-controlled contested space to retrieve 43 personnel from a crippled cruiser, the losses on the rescue mission would likely exceed the lives saved. This is the rational calculation. This is the calculation every collective officer is trained to make and accept. We are professionals. We understand the logic of acceptable loss. I understand the logic. I have been understanding the logic for 17 rotations, and I am very tired of it. On rotation 12 I found Specialist Grevhan in the lower corridor speaking to the dead. This is not metaphorical. There is a row of emergency stasis units on Deck 4 where we placed the 14 crew members who were injured too severely to remain conscious and too injured to survive without intervention we could not provide. They are not dead. They are suspended. But they are not awake, and Grevhan was sitting cross-legged in front of the unit containing crewman Thresh and talking to her in a low voice about her family on the Veth homeworld and what they were probably doing right now and whether she remembered the time she burned the mess rations so badly that the smell lingered for 2 full ship weeks. I stood in the corridor and watched him for longer than I should have. There is no tactical value in speaking to someone who cannot hear you. There is no survival advantage. It does not repair the reactor or recalibrate the sensor array or improve our odds by any measurable unit. I know this. Grevhan knew this. He kept talking anyway. I went back to my post. I had nothing useful to say about it. I filed it in the section of my mind I had recently begun to label things I am not processing right now, which was becoming a very crowded section. The humans appeared on my sensors at the beginning of rotation 18. Not one contact. Not a scout probe or a communications buoy or any of the preliminary signals a rational fleet sends before committing to a contested zone. 14 contacts. Simultaneous fold space emergence signatures, appearing in a cluster formation approximately 12 light minutes from the debris field's outer edge. I stared at the readout. Then, I ran the identification protocol because I assumed I had made an error. I had not made an error. Human Confederation vessel designations. 2 destroyers. 12 additional vessels categorized initially as transports, though the weapon signatures were wrong, 4 transports. Modified. Retrofitted in ways that suggested someone with very strong opinions and access to a lot of welding equipment had spent a significant amount of time making transports into something that was not quite a transport anymore. My secondary nerve cluster fired 3 times in rapid succession. I pressed my palm flat against the console because when it does that I find pressure helps, though I could not have told you why I knew that at this moment. Contact, I said. My voice came out strangely level. 14 contacts, outer edge of the field. Human Confederation configuration. Senior Engineer Vethmarin looked up from the power management console. Human. We sent them a signal? We had sent the distress signal broadband. Which meant every faction within reception range had received it. Which included human space, which bordered the contested zone along the spinward edge. Which I had noted 17 rotations ago and filed in the section of my mind labeled things I am not processing right now because the collective and the Human Confederation were not at war but were also not what any functional diplomat would call allied, and the idea of humans responding to a Vethari distress call with a 14-vessel fleet had seemed like a fantasy so implausible it wasn't worth torturing myself with. We sent it broadband, I said. Vethmarin was quiet for a moment. They came. I did not respond. I was watching the sensor readout, where 14 human ships were holding position at the field edge, not advancing, running what appeared to be a very thorough scan of the debris field's interior. Patient. Methodical. Taking their time in a way that suggested they were serious about the next step. The Keth will see them, Vethmarin said. Yes. Keth has 3 warships at the field's far edge. 2 patrol drones in active sweep configuration. I know. This is going to provoke an engagement. I know. They came anyway. I didn't answer that either. There was nothing wrong with what he'd said. I just didn't have a framework to put it in. The first human communication came 40 minutes after their arrival. Tight beam, aimed precisely at our hull despite the debris interference, which told me they had already mapped the field with a degree of accuracy that made my sensor array look like a child's toy. The signal was compressed, short, and, when I decoded it, 3 sentences: received your distress call. Have a fix on your position. Hold tight, we're coming to get you. That was all. No preamble. No negotiation with Keth. No request for collective authorization. No reference to the political complications of a human fleet entering contested space to rescue personnel of a different species with whom they had a relationship best described as cautiously non-hostile. No acknowledgement that this was, by any military doctrine I had ever been trained in, a tactical situation with extraordinarily poor odds. Hold tight. We're coming to get you. I read it 4 times. I read it 4 times and, then, I did something I have not done since I was in officer training and, a senior instructor told me in front of 12 of my peers that my spatial reasoning scores were the lowest in the cohort's history. My secondary nerve cluster fired so hard and, so continuously that my vision went slightly gray at the edges, and, I had to breathe very carefully for approximately 90 seconds before I could speak. Vethmarin was watching me. They're coming in, I said. Into the field. Into the field. He looked at the sensor display. At the Keth warships on the far side. At the patrol drones. At the debris density map that marked our position as being in one of the most difficult to navigate sectors of an already difficult field. How? I didn't know. I transmitted back, acknowledged. We are at 11% power, minimal maneuvering capability. Keth patrol drones pass our position every 6 rotations. Next pass estimated 2 rotations. The response came in 40 seconds. Yep, we see the drones. Don't transmit again, we've got you on passive. Don't do anything to spike your power signature. We'll handle the approach. Sergeant Reeves, HCF Ardent Reach. Don't transmit again. I stopped transmitting. I sat at my console. I watched the sensor readout where 14 human ships, with a casualness that made something in my chest do a very uncomfortable thing, began to move. I had studied human military doctrine at the academy. It is part of the standard Xenopolicy curriculum, not because we expected to fight them at the time, but because the collective considers it prudent to understand any spacefaring civilization that has demonstrated the capability and willingness to fight wars. The curriculum covered their tactical formations, their weapon systems, their command structure. It was 3 modules long and I had passed all 3 with adequate marks. I want to say, for the record, that the curriculum was inadequate. The part of the curriculum that described human tactical doctrine noted that humans have a tendency toward unconventional problem-solving under pressure, and prefer direct engagement over positional maneuvering, and have a higher-than-average risk tolerance across documented species. This is all technically accurate. It is also the equivalent of describing a plasma fire as warm. What I watched on my sensors over the next rotation was not reckless. I want to be precise about that. I have seen reckless. I have seen commanders make bad decisions under panic and call it boldness. What the human fleet did was not that. It was systematic. The 2 destroyers did not enter the field. They positioned themselves at the outer edge, at angles that I recognized, after a moment's analysis, as covering the 2 most likely Keth approach vectors from the warships on the far side. They were not there to go in. They were the reason going in was possible. The 12 modified transports entered the field in a staggered column. They moved slowly. This was the part that confused me initially. I had expected speed, the human preference for direct engagement suggesting a fast, aggressive approach. They moved slowly and carefully, threading between debris clusters, and I watched their sensor signatures and realized after several minutes that they were mapping as they moved. Not using the map to navigate. Building it. Real time. Every ship feeding data to every other ship, the column adjusting fractionally with each new piece of information, learning the field as they entered it. Patient. The Keth patrol drones were on an outbound sweep when the column began its approach. I tracked both. The drones would return in approximately 90 minutes. The column was moving at a pace that would put them. I ran the calculation approximately 40% of the way to our position when the drones returned. This did not seem, to me, like a workable situation. I sat on my hands to stop myself from transmitting. The drones came back early. 12 minutes early. I do not know why, perhaps a pattern variation, perhaps a response to some sensor ghost in the outer field, perhaps simple mechanical randomness. They came back 12 minutes early and the column was 38% through the field and I watched the drone trajectories and my secondary nerve cluster made a sound. I did not know it could make sounds audible to me, but it did, a low internal hum that I can only describe as the physical sensation of a number coming out wrong. The lead drone sweep arc was going to cross the column in approximately 6 minutes. I did not transmit. Reeves had said not to transmit. I held my breath and I watched. The column stopped. All 12 ships. Simultaneously. Dead stop, power signatures dropping, not off, not fully, but dropping in a way that made the debris field's background radiation suddenly much more prominent relative to the ship's signatures. They were not invisible. But they were considerably less visible. And then they waited. I watched the drone sweep across the field. Slow, methodical, the targeting array pulsing at regular intervals. It crossed the region of the field where the column was stopped, where 12 human ships were sitting without moving, power suppressed, running silent. The drone continued its sweep. It did not fire. It did not deviate. It passed. The column began moving again. I stared at my console for a long time. The console had a small scratch on its lower left corner that I had never noticed before. Diagonal. Approximately 2 centimeters. I stared at that scratch for quite a while. Veth Marin appeared at my shoulder. Did they just yes? How did they know the drone's detection threshold precisely enough to, I don't know? They had to know the exact suppression level. The drone uses a modified Keth7 array, the sensitivity parameters on that model are, I know what model it is. So how did they, I don't know, I said again. My voice was doing something I did not want it to do. They scanned the drones before entering. They must have pulled the specifications. Or they've engaged Keth patrols before and documented the parameters. I paused. Or they guessed and they were right. Veth Marin was quiet. I do not know which of those options I find more unsettling, I said. He went back to his console without answering. The scratch on mine was still there. Still diagonal. Still 2 centimeters. They reached us 4 rotations later. The lead transport, the Arden Reach, designation visible when it was close enough for optical, came alongside the Sorrow of Veth with a steadiness that I found almost offensive, given what it had just navigated to get there. Its hull was scarred. Not freshly, these were old scars, a ship that had been through a great deal before this mission and had apparently decided that none of it was sufficient reason to stop operating. There was a patch on the forward hull plate, clearly not original manufacture, clearly applied at some point after significant damage, and the weld lines were visible from our viewport. Someone had fixed it. Not prettily. Durably. An airlock connection was made to our emergency port. The seal engaged. I was at the junction when the door opened and the first human came through. I have dealt with humans before. Brief diplomatic exchanges. The human advisors attached to the collective's Third Fleet. I was not unprepared, as such. I was not prepared. He was not large, by human standards. I think I have limited comparison data. Medium height for the species, broad through the shoulders in the way that suggests the body has been asked difficult things repeatedly and has complied. His armor was the matte gray of the HCF ground forces, and it had a long diagonal scrape across the chest plate that went through what had been a unit insignia and left it partially illegible. He had a weapon slung and he held it in a way that was not aimed but was also not careless. It occupied a middle position I did not have a precise word for in my language, something that translated roughly as ready without intention, which is not a state I had seen a being maintain while walking through a doorway in what was technically a non-hostile boarding. He looked at me. Then, he looked past me, down the corridor, at the row of emergency stasis units visible through the open door to Deck 4. How many in stasis, he said. 14. Stable? 4 now. The cells have approximately 40 rotations of power remaining. Our own, I got your power situation from the scan. He was already moving, looking at the junction panels, at the emergency lighting, at the damage indicators on the wall. Not looking at me, exactly looking at the ship. Reading it. We brought a portable reactor. We can stabilize your power before we start the extraction. Take us about 20 minutes to set up. He glanced at me briefly. You're Sarath? Vel Sarath, yes. How? You were the one sending the signals. Transmission pattern suggested a single operator. He moved to the corridor junction and looked down both directions with the calm of someone making an inventory. Any Keth contact since we entered the field? No. Your approach was. I stopped. He looked at me, waiting. Effective, I finished. He almost smiled. Not quite. There was something at the corner of his mouth that suggested a smile was available if the situation warranted it, but the situation did not currently warrant it, and he was the sort of person who kept those things separate. We've got maybe 6 hours before the Keth warships on the far side respond to our destroyer's holding position, he said. I want your people loaded and your critical systems stripped by hour 4. Can you give me a list of what's worth taking? I stopped again. Yes. Yes, I can do that. Good. He keyed his calm Reeves to team. We're in. Begin reactor deployment, start with the stasis section. Sarath's going to get us an asset list. He looked at me one more time. You held it together for 17 days on 11%. That's good work. He said it the way you say something that is simply true, not to make me feel better, not as a tactic. The way you note a correctly filed report or a well-calibrated sensor. A fact. Then, he was already moving toward the stasis units, talking into his comm, because there was work to do and he had apparently decided that work was the relevant thing now. I stood in the corridor. My secondary nerve cluster was completely silent for the first time in 17 rotations. The emergency lighting hummed. The ship listed 4 degrees to port side. Somewhere on the Arden Reach, I could hear voices and the clang of equipment moving through an airlock, and it was the loudest sound I had heard in 17 rotations, and I had not known until that moment that silence had a weight. It does. And then, it was gone. His name was Sergeant Darius Reeves, HCF Ground Forces, attached to the extraction unit aboard the Ardent Reach. I learned this from the partial insignia on his chest plate and from the ship's manifest that his communications officer, a small, quick-moving human woman named Corporal Adeyemi, transmitted to my console during the first 20 minutes of the operation. I was not given this information because I asked for it. I was given it because Adeyemi appeared to operate under the assumption that all relevant parties should have all relevant information at all times, and she transmitted it with the same energy she applied to everything else, which was thorough, fast, and slightly impatient with anyone who couldn't keep up. The reactor deployment took 19 minutes. I watched it happen from the Deck 4 junction. 2 humans, both of them in the same matte gray armor, both of them moving with a coordination that suggested they had done this specific task before and had opinions about how it should be done, brought a portable power unit through our airlock, through the corridor, and into position beside the stasis units. The unit was heavy. I could tell this from the way they carried it, the angles of their bodies, the deliberate placement of each step. It was heavy and they did not slow down. They connected it to the stasis junction in 12 minutes and, then, spent the remaining 7 minutes on the power management grid for the life support section. Not because they had to, the stasis units were the critical function, and those were stable at the 7-minute mark. They spent the extra time on life support because, as the taller of the two said to his partner without looking up from the panel, may as well do it right. The other one said, agreed, and handed him a connector. I stood at the junction and did not say anything and stared at the panel on the wall that I had stared at for 17 rotations. It showed our power at 11%. Then, 12. Then, 14. Then, 18. The life support indicator went from amber to green for the first time since rotation 2. Green. I had forgotten what green looked like on that panel. I went back to my console and began compiling the asset list Reeves had requested. I focused on this with a degree of attention that was, in retrospect, disproportionate to the task. The asset list did not require that level of attention. But, it was a task with clear parameters and a deliverable endpoint, and I needed, very badly, something with clear parameters and a deliverable endpoint. Reeves came to my console 40 minutes into the operation. He looked at the list I had compiled: systems, equipment, data cores, specialist tools worth taking from the sorrow of Veth before we abandoned her, and he read it with the focused attention of someone who reads technical documents often and has learned to find the significant information fast. He made 3 additions in handwriting on the physical notepad he carried, which I noticed because I had not seen a physical notepad used by a military officer of any species in several years. It was worn at the corners and the cover had been repaired with a piece of tape that was not quite the same color as the original material. "You're leaving off the navigational cores," he said. "They were damaged in the second barrage. I assessed them as non-viable. For standard use, sure. Adeyemi can pull the undamaged memory sectors for raw data. We've got the tools." He wrote something else. "You've also got a Type 7 environmental scanner in the science bay. Those are discontinued, Collective doesn't make them anymore. Someone will want it." I looked at him. "You know Collective equipment catalogs. Know a guy who knows." He handed the notepad back to me. Not the list he'd written on, the whole notepad. "Keep this. You'll need to direct traffic." I looked at the notepad. "This is your personal, I've got another one." He was already turning away. 20 minutes on the non-critical gear. 40 on the stasis transport. We're going to be careful with that. We've got a medical bay on the Ardent Reach, but it's sized for humans. Your stasis units are going to be a tight fit. He paused. How are your ambulatory survivors? Anyone who can't walk out on their own? I consulted my log. 3 with injuries that compromise mobility. Specialist Grevhan has a fracture in his lower limb structure. 2 others with, get me descriptions of their mobility limitations, I'll sort the carry plan. He said this without any particular inflection, not reluctance, not additional willingness. Just, this is part of the work, tell me what I need to know. Sergeant. The word came out before I had decided to say it. He stopped. You have 6 hours. The Keth warships, more like 5, now. 5 hours. To extract 43 personnel, their critical equipment, 14 stasis units, and navigate back through the debris field. Yeah. He didn't seem to find this assessment as alarming as I did. This is going to be close. Probably. He looked at me with a directness I had learned, in my limited experience with humans, was not aggression. It was simply how they looked at things they were deciding about. You've been here 17 days. Yes. On 11% reactor power. Yes. That's 5 hours of work. You've already done the hard part. He said it with complete conviction. Not to reassure me. Not performed. As if this were simply a correct observation about the situation that it would be strange not to make. Then, get me those mobility descriptions. He laughed. I looked at the notepad in my hands. Then, I looked at the power panel, still green, and wrote the mobility descriptions. The extraction of the stasis units was not fast. Reeves had predicted 40 minutes and it took 53, because the units were sized for Vetheri physiology and the Ardent Reach's corridors were sized for humans, and the overlap between those 2 specifications was not generous. The humans solved this by removing a secondary corridor partition. Not carefully. They had a tool, I have no better description for it than a tool. It appeared to be improvised from a cutting implement and something that was not originally a cutting implement, and they used it on the partition with the focused pragmatism of people who have decided that a wall is a lesser priority than a 14 comatose crew problem. The partition came out. The stasis units went through. Specialist Grevhan was carried by a human named Private Okeke, who was shorter than I expected from the armor and who carried Grevhan with a competence that suggested this was not the first time she had been asked to physically transport someone significantly larger than herself. Grevhan, who had been conscious and ambulatory, slowly, since the reactor stabilization, objected to being carried on the grounds that he was capable of moving under his own power. You've got a fractured radius equivalent and it's been 17 days, Okeke told him, already moving. You can walk next time. Grevhan looked at me over her shoulder with an expression I could not entirely classify. Next time, he said to me. I did not know what to say to that. The possibility of a next time had not been a thought I had been allowing myself. It sat in my mind like an object left in the wrong place, unfamiliar and slightly too large for the space it occupied. The asset retrieval went faster than the stasis transport because the humans applied to it a division of labor that was, I admit, more efficient than the system I would have designed. Adeyemi ran the inventory, checking items against my list with a scanning device that she operated with one hand while making notes on her own physical pad. They all had physical pads, I noticed. This seemed to be a preference, not a supply issue, while 2 others actually moved the equipment. A third human operated a small wheeled transport platform that had been brought through the airlock and which navigated the sorrow of Veth's damaged corridors with an ease that seemed, to me, to reflect less good fortune and, more the fact that the human operating it had spent several minutes at the outset mapping the corridor widths before beginning. They did not move fast and chaotic. They moved fast and organized, which is a different thing entirely, and produces different results. I moved alongside Adeyemi for a portion of this, because she had questions about the navigational cores that required my technical knowledge, and because I found, I will admit this here, in this log, because there is no one to observe me admitting it, that I did not want to stand still. 17 rotations of standing still. Of holding position and holding position and holding position. I did not want to hold position anymore. The undamaged sectors should be accessible through the secondary port, I told her, indicating the core housing. The primary port was destroyed in the barrage, but the memory architecture is partitioned, the damaged sectors are isolated. How isolated? She was already opening the housing. Fully. The partition is a hardware function, not software. The undamaged sectors cannot be corrupted by adjacent damage. Good design. It is standard collective engineering practice for exactly this contingency. Smart. She connected her retrieval device to the secondary port. Numbers moved on her screen. How much data? Approximately 40 cycles of navigational records. Course histories, stellar cartography updates for this region, debris field mapping data. She looked at me for half a second. You've been mapping the debris field. It seemed worthwhile. 17 rotations is a significant amount of passive sensor time. She looked back at her screen. We'll take it all. A pause. This is going to be useful to a lot of people. The Kessler field navigation data alone, it was something to do, I said. She glanced at me again. There was something in her expression that I did not have a precise name for in my language. There is a word, severet, that means roughly the recognition of a particular kind of grief that has been converting itself into work, and it is not a complimentary word in Vetheri culture. It implies a failure to process correctly, but, in that moment, watching Adeyemi's expression, I thought that perhaps in some languages it might not be an insult. Yeah, she said. I get that. She pulled the core and moved to the next item on the list. 3 hours and 40 minutes into the operation, the Keth moved. Not the patrol drones, those continued their sweep cycles, undisturbed, the column suppression protocol having apparently held throughout. The 3 Keth warships on the far side of the field began to reposition. Slow, at first. Careful. But the direction was not ambiguous. They were coming toward the 2 human destroyers. The destroyers had not moved from their position at the field's edge. I watched their sensor signatures steady, unperturbed, the patience of ships that are where they have decided to be and have not decided otherwise. Reeves appeared at my shoulder. He had been at his calm intermittently throughout the operation. I had assumed he was coordinating the extraction teams. He was also, it turned out, in continuous contact with the destroyers. They've been watching the Keth repositioning for 20 minutes, he said. He was looking at my sensor display with an expression that was not quite calm. There was something beneath it, a calculation working, the expression of a person who is doing very fast math and wants to appear as though they are not doing very fast math. Commander Osei says the engagement window is approximately 90 minutes from now. 3-2 odds in firepower aren't terrible for the destroyers, but she'd rather not test them. We have 1 hour and 20 minutes of work remaining, I said. He looked at the sensor display. Then, we have 10 minutes of margin. That is not a comfortable margin. No. He keyed his calm Reeves to all teams. We're accelerating the timeline. Skip the non-essential secondary list, jump straight to personnel assembly. Anyone not in a stasis unit gets to the airlocks in the next 40 minutes. Move. The response from his teams came in a series of acknowledgements, fast and overlapping, and then, the sound of the work changing, not faster exactly, but different. The way running changes from a jog. Something that had been efficient became urgent, and the distinction between those 2 states was audible in the footsteps in the corridor. I looked at the sensor display. At the Keth warships moving. At the 2 destroyers holding. The destroyers, I said. What about them? They are positioned to be between the Keth warships and the field entry point. Yes. If the Keth warships engage them, then they'll have an engagement to deal with. Reeves was still watching the display. The Ardent reach and the column get out, the destroyers disengage at their discretion. The destroyers are covering the extraction. Yes. They came into Keth contested space, positioned themselves at the entry point of an active combat zone, and their function in this operation is to draw fire away from the extraction column if the Keth respond. That's the general idea. He said this with the tone of someone explaining a straightforward logistical arrangement. I looked at the display. Then, at him. Those are. I stopped. I did not have a word that was correct for what I was trying to say. In Vetheri military doctrine, the covering force is a position of calculated acceptable risk. The unit assigned to it has accepted a worse outcome probability for the benefit of the primary mission. This is understood and accepted, and there is a word for it, a formal designation, and it has a kind of finality to it, a term that closes a possibility. The human word for it, as far as I knew, was volunteers. How many on each destroyer? I asked. 300, give or take. They volunteered to come here. Knowing this was the probable role. Yeah. He looked at me briefly. Nobody held a gun to their heads. I processed this. How many people know about this rescue operation? On the human side. The fleet knows. The operation was put together fast. We had 36 hours from receiving your signal to wheels up. 36 hours to assemble 14 ships and transit to a contested zone for a rescue operation involving a different species. Tight timeline, he agreed. This is not a Confederation military operation, I said. I had been looking at the manifest. The ship registries. The operational designations. The Confederation authorized the operation, but, the fleet composition, these are not standard assigned units. He was quiet for a moment. Reeves. Some of it's regular, he said. The destroyers are active fleet. Most of the column is reserve. He picked up his notepad. We put the call out. These were the ships that showed up. Showed up. Showed up. I stood at my console and looked at the sensor display, at 14 ships that had come out of fold space into a contested zone to retrieve 43 beings they had never met because a distress signal had gone out on a broadband channel and they had received it, and, outside, at the edge of the field, 600 human beings and 2 destroyers were holding position between the Keth warships and the exit route, and they had showed up. The panel on the wall was still green. I picked up Reeves' notepad and went to help direct the personnel assembly. The last thing I took from the Sorrow of Veth was not on the asset list. Grevhan had been placed in the Arden Reaches medical bay by the time I went back through the connecting airlock for the final check. The stasis units were loaded. The equipment was loaded. Adeyemi had confirmed the navigational core data. All 43 personnel accounted for. Reeves was at the airlock doing his final communications check with the destroyers. I went back to Deck 4. The stasis units were gone. The corridor was empty. The emergency lighting hummed in the way it had hummed for 17 rotations, that particular frequency that I had stopped hearing somewhere around rotation 8 and had only noticed again when it was joined by other sounds, human voices, equipment, footsteps. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then, I went to the observation port on Deck 4, a small viewport, cracked at the lower corner from the barrage, still intact, and I looked out at the debris field. 17 rotations of wreckage and, cold and, the low amber glow of distant Keth energy signatures. I had looked at this exact view from this exact port every rotation, usually once in what served as morning and, once before what served as sleep. I had not looked at it as anything. It had just been the view that was there. Looking at it now, it was different. Not the view was the same. But, something in the quality of looking at it was different. There is a word in Vetheri Velathos that means the specific grief of leaving a place you survived. It is not the same as leaving a place you loved. You may not have loved it. The survival is the thing. The fact that this place held you, however, badly, however, barely, and, now you are leaving and, the place will continue without you and, you without it. It is a minor grief, a small bureaucratic feeling sadness that has no room in operational planning. Most of us ignore it. I stood at the viewport for approximately 90 seconds and did not ignore it. Then, I went back to the airlock, where Reeves was waiting with the patience of someone who knows when to wait and when not to, and I nodded, and we sealed the door behind us, and the Sorrow of Veth fell away into the debris field as the Arden Reach began to move. The transit back through the debris field took 1 hour and 17 minutes. I know this because I timed it. I was in the Ardent Reach's secondary command post, a modest compartment with 2 sensor consoles, a communications array, and a viewport on the port side, and I had nothing to do except monitor and time things. Reeves was on the bridge. His team was distributed through the ship, attending to the newly boarded survivors. I was in the secondary command post because I had asked to be there, and Adeyemi had said fine and shown me the console without ceremony and gone back to what she was doing. The field transit was different from the outside than it had been from the inside. From the sorrow of Eth, the debris field was the world, a static, permanent thing that surrounded and contained. From the Ardent Reach, moving, it was a landscape. Things changed. New angles. Different density clusters. The amber glow of the Keth energy signatures was visible from the port side and then not visible and then visible again as we threaded through the debris, and each time it vanished I found something in my secondary nerve cluster that I could only describe as a brief, involuntary relief, and each time it reappeared I found the opposite. The column moved in the same formation as the approach. Staggered. Patient. Building the map. At the 40-minute mark, the 2 Keth warships completed their repositioning. They were now between the human destroyers and the field edge. Not fully blocking his space is large enough that no 2 ships truly block anything, but positioned in a way that made the destroyers' exit, if they chose to take it, require passing within weapons range of both Keth vessels. The 3rd Keth ship was holding further back, a reserve or a second line. The destroyers had not moved. I was watching their sensor signatures with one eye and the column's progress with the other when Reeves appeared in the secondary command post doorway. He did not come in immediately. He stood at the threshold in a way that I had observed was a habit of his, the pause before entering a space, a brief assessment, the door as a frame for a decision. "How's the field looking?" he asked. "The column is 43% through. No drone interference." I indicated the display showing the destroyer positions. "The Keth have repositioned." "I see that." He came in and looked at the display over my shoulder. His breathing pattern did not change. There was no visible stress indicator. "Osei's going to hold position until we're at the field edge. And then, she'll disengage. Standard breakaway protocol, she's faster than the Keth ships. She'll fold before they close to optimal weapons range." "Will or should?" He glanced at me. "Should," he said, and it was a precise distinction and he made it without apology. 3-2 is survivable odds if she has to fight. She'd rather not. But she will, if necessary. He looked at the display. She went into contested space with 2 destroyers to cover a rescue operation. Yeah, she'll fight if necessary. I looked at the display too. At the destroyer signatures, steady, patient, unperturbed in the way that only something that has already made its decision is unperturbed. On the other side of the field, the column moving through debris, 43 Vetheri survivors alive because humans showed up. "Why?" I said. Reeves turned his head slightly. "You received a distress signal from a species that is not at war with you but is also not an ally. A species with whom the Confederation has, at best, a working diplomatic non-aggression arrangement. You assembled 14 ships in 36 hours and entered a Keth contested zone to retrieve 43 beings you have never met." I looked at him. Why? It was not entirely a question. It was also an inventory. A list I was building. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't have an answer, the quiet of someone deciding how much of the real answer to give. "Then, you sent a distress signal." "Many species send distress signals. Many distress signals go unanswered." "Yeah." He said it without judgment. "We heard yours. That is not a reason." "No." He looked at the display. "You had 43 people on a ship with a failing reactor and Keth drones and 17 days of." He stopped. "You had 43 people. That's the reason. I processed this. That's all." "That's all," he said. I looked at the display. At the sensor contact labeled Arden reach ourselves, moving through the field at measured, careful speed, the column ahead and, behind, the destroyers holding at the edge. You could have died, I said. Could still. And, this was, the right thing to do. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without inflection, the tone of someone stating a measurement. Not performing conviction. Not explaining a philosophy. Just, this is the number, this is the weight, this is the thing that is true. I looked at the scratched surface of the secondary console. It had a sticker on the corner, small, circular, showing a simplified image of something I could not identify, a small rounded shape with what appeared to be trailing lines. Someone had placed it there deliberately. Not for any tactical reason. Simply because they had wanted it there. I did not ask about it. I filed it in the section of my mind that was rapidly exceeding its intended capacity. At the 60-minute mark, something went wrong with the column's second ship. Not catastrophic. A proximity alert, a debris cluster that had shifted position, subtly, from the original scan, the way things drift in a field of competing microgravitational pulls. The second ship detected it with approximately 40 seconds of clearance. In a different situation, 40 seconds is manageable. In the debris field, threading a gap at precisely calibrated speed, 40 seconds and a cluster in the wrong position is a problem. The column stopped again. Not all of it. The lead ship, the Arden Reach, continued forward, and the ships behind the second vessel also stopped, but there was now a gap in the column, and a debris cluster drifting through that gap, and a 40-second window that was now a 30-second window. I watched the display. The second ship, the one with the obstruction, transmitted its navigation data to the column. This I could see from the data traffic. Then, it did something I did not immediately understand, it moved laterally. Not backward. Not forward. Sideways, a controlled drift, angling toward a gap in the debris that was, I ran the math as it moved, tighter than the ship's profile by approximately 4%. 4%. That was the margin. On both sides. It moved through the gap. My secondary nerve cluster fired twice. I noted this and did not address it. The column reformed. Moving again. The debris cluster continued its drift on the trajectory it had always been on, through the space the second ship had just vacated, and disappeared into the field behind us. Reeves let out a breath. I looked at him. He had been watching the display with an expression I now recognized as the face he makes when the math works out, but he would have preferred not to have had to do the math. 4%, I said. Yep. The pilot calculated that gap clearance in approximately 20 seconds. Nalin's good. He said it with a brevity that suggested Nalin was, in fact, extraordinarily good, and that saying so in a longer sentence would be unnecessary and possibly embarrassing to Nalin, who was presumably not present to be embarrassed. 4% on both sides, I said again. You counting? I count things. It helps. He glanced at me, and there was something in his expression, brief, there and gone, that I did not parse immediately. Not pity. Not amusement. The expression of someone who has encountered a behavior that is, unexpectedly, familiar. Then, he looked back at the display. We're going to make it, he said. You don't know that. No. He picked up his notepad and looked at it. But, I'm operating on the assumption that we are, because the alternative assumption doesn't make me better at my job. I looked at the display. The field edge was now visible on the long-range sensors, the open space beyond, the two destroyers, the repositioned Keth warships. 30 minutes of navigation remaining. Is that something you learned? I said. Operating on the assumption of success. More like, he paused. It's what you have to do. You can know the odds are bad and still choose to work like they're going to come out right. Doesn't mean you're pretending the odds are good. It means you've decided the outcome you're working toward is worth working toward regardless. I thought about this. That is, I searched for the right word. Unusual. Probably. Most species with a functioning threat response system would categorize that cognitive approach as maladaptive. An inability to correctly weight negative probability. Yeah. He made a note on his pad. I could not see what the note was. We're aware that's what it looks like. The destroyers opened fire at the 93-minute mark, when the column was 7 minutes from the field edge. Not because the Keth engaged them. Because the third Keth ship, the one that had held in reserve position, made a repositioning that the destroyer commander apparently assessed as preparation for an attack on the column's exit vector. I watched the sensor data in real time, the third Keth ship moving, the destroyers recognizing the movement, a 3-second gap between recognition and response. The destroyers fired first. Focused, precise engagement targeting the third ship's drive systems, not its crew compartments. The Keth ship's drives took 2 direct hits and it began to drift, slow, leaking propellant. Not destroyed. Disabled. The other 2 Keth warships responded by engaging the destroyers. The destroyers returned fire and broke toward the exit, the standard breakaway Reeves had described, fast, angled to maximize the velocity differential, and I watched the engagement on my display and my secondary nerve cluster was making sounds again, that low internal hum, as the distance between the destroyers and the pursuing Keth ships changed second by second. They're going to make it, Reeves said. He was watching the display too. The margin is, they're going to make it. Not a prediction this time. A decision. The same tone as earlier. Working toward. The column reached the field edge at the 99-minute mark. The Ardent Reach cleared the field last, having held the rear position throughout the return transit. When we emerged into open space, the stars went from fractured and debris occluded to clean, vast, the full view that I had been looking at from the cracked viewport for 17 rotations and that now looked, somehow, larger. Different. Maybe it was that the ship was moving. Maybe it was that there were other ships around us, 11 of the column vessels already clear, full space drives spinning up, and, in the distance, the 2 destroyers pulling away from the Keth pursuit at a rate that the numbers said was sufficient. The numbers said sufficient. The destroyers folded. There and, then, not there, the particular disappearance of fold space entry, a compression and release, and the 2 ships were gone, already somewhere else, already safe, and the Keth warships that had been pursuing them were left holding a position in open space with nothing to pursue. The column was gone 30 seconds later. We folded into the transit corridor and the debris field vanished and there was the strange, seamless non-sensation of fold space and, then, the Ardent Reach came out of fold at a transfer point 6 light hours from the contested zone, and around us the rest of the column was emerging, and the destroyers were there, both of them, and I ran a scan on both ships' hull integrity out of habit and both came back with minor damage indicators and both crew manifests came back at full count. Full count. I sat at the secondary console and looked at the display for a long time. Grevhan came to find me 2 hours after the fold, when the ship had settled into the standard rhythms of transit and people had begun to move around it as if it were simply a ship and not a place where extraordinary things had recently occurred. He was walking. Slowly, with care, his fractured limb in a support brace provided by the Ardent Reach's medic, a human named Pharaoh who had spent 40 minutes with Grevhan using a scanner and a translator and what appeared to be genuine personal interest in the specific details of Vetheri bone structure. Grevhan had come away from the medical bay looking slightly stunned. Pharaoh says the fracture will heal completely, he said, sitting beside me. She seemed surprised I was concerned about long-term function. Apparently for their species, clean fractures of load-bearing structures are, she said, routine. She said this as if she was trying to be reassuring. It was probably meant to be. The bones, she said, knit back denser at the fracture site. Structurally stronger afterward. He paused. She said this with the same tone in which one might mention that precipitation is expected later in the day. I thought about Reeves saying we're going to make it in the tone of someone filing a correct observation. I'm beginning to think that's simply how they communicate, I said. Grevhan was quiet for a moment. She asked if I wanted something to eat. I said no. She brought something anyway. He looked down at the pack in his hands, a human ration, sealed, with a label in script I couldn't read. She said it was mild. By their standards, she said, which she mentioned twice, with some emphasis. Probably wise to apply a correction factor to mild. I applied a significant correction factor and, then, applied it again. He set the pack down. We sat in the secondary command post. He had known to find me here. I had not moved since the fold, and the ship hummed, and the stars outside the viewport were the regular stars of non-contested space, nothing broken about them, nothing amber, just stars. Thresh is stable, Grevhan said. Pharaoh checked all 14 stasis units within the first hour. I know. She transmitted the status report. You read it. I read it 4 times. He looked at the viewport. We're going to make it back. We are going to make it back. And, then, they're going to file reports about this, and there will be meetings and diplomatic correspondence and political assessments about what it means that a human fleet entered contested Keth space to rescue a Vetheri crew. Yes. And, the reports will miss the point. I looked at him. They'll frame it as a strategic decision, he said. A Confederation calculation about galactic positioning, or an investment in Vetheri relations, or a test of force projection capability. He looked at the ration pack in his hands. And, it might have been all of those things, on some level, in some meeting room somewhere. I don't know the Confederation's politics. But Pharaoh asked me if I wanted something to eat and brought me something when I said no, and the people in the debris field moved a partition wall and called it solving a problem, and someone named Nullin flew a ship through a 4% gap because it was the direction that kept the column moving. He paused. And, the distress signal was broadband. They didn't have to answer it. No, I said. They didn't. Outside the viewport, the stars moved with the slow drift of transit. Someone in the forward section of the ship was playing music. I could hear it faintly, coming through the ventilation, a human melody with a pattern that did not resolve the way Vetheri music resolves, that seemed to keep circling back to the same phrase and finding new things in it each time. I had been hearing it intermittently since the fold. I still could not have told you if it was the same song each time. Velsaroth, Grevhan said. Yes. What are you going to write in your report? I thought about it. About the sensor display showing 14 contacts. About the reactor reading green. About Reeves and his notepad and the sticker on the secondary console that was still there, still circular, the small rounded shape I had not identified. About held tight, we're coming to get you, 3 sentences, no preamble, from a ship that was already moving. I'm going to write exactly what happened, I said. They'll still miss the point. Yes. I looked at the viewport. But, some of them won't. And, the ones who don't will remember it. I paused. And, so will we. Grevhan opened the ration pack. He looked at the contents for a moment with an expression of careful assessment. Pharaoh said it tastes like she used a word I couldn't translate. Something close to home, but not quite. She may have been being poetic. Or she may have been being accurate. He took a small, experimental portion. His expression moved through several stages of evaluation. It is warm. It is several things at once. Is that a good thing? He considered this for a moment. I think, he said, it might be the point. The music from the forward section cycled back to its recurring phrase, found something new in it, and continued. I took out my log and began writing. Not the official report, that could wait. This. The things that happened in the order they happened, with the details the official report would not include, the diagonal scratch on the console, the sound of silence ending, the way a ship looks when it has decided the outcome it is working toward is worth working toward regardless. The way 14 ships look when they appear out of fold space in a place where no one expected anything to appear, and the math is wrong and they came anyway, and there are no speeches about it and no explanations, and the person in charge of the operation writes hold tight in 3 sentences and his voice, when he says you've already done the hard part, makes it sound like the most straightforward thing in the world. I wrote it all down. Outside, the stars were regular stars, and the Arden Reach moved through them without hesitation, toward a destination that was now simply a destination rather than a probability, and somewhere in the medical bay 14 Vetheri were suspended in their cells and 43 were not, and, in the secondary command post the ventilation moved the faint music through the air, that phrase, circling, finding new things, and, I wrote, And Grevhan sat beside me eating something that was warm. And several things at once, and neither of us said anything else for a long time. There was nothing else that needed saying. The report would miss the point. Some of them always do. But the thing that happened had happened, and I had seen it, and I was still seeing it, and I understood, not entirely, not cleanly, not the way I understand a sensor reading or a reactor value, but in the way that some things get inside you before you have a chance to decide whether to let them in. I understood something about 14 ships that showed up because a signal went out and they received it. The galaxy is large. The math is often bad. The distress signals go out on broadband and most of them go unanswered, and the rational calculation is what it is. And then, sometimes the contacts appear on your sensor display and you run the identification protocol because you think you've made an error and you have not made an error, and there are 14 of them and they are already moving, and a voice says hold tight, and it does not occur to that voice, not for even 1 second, that this was not the obvious thing to do. I filed that in no section. I let it stay where it landed. It was still there when I stopped writing.